A couple standing at a grave, their hands intertwined, symbolizing healing and closure. The wife and husband standing under a tree, golden sunlight filtering through, symbolizing a new beginning. Morning light streamed through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the bedroom. But for her, there was no warmth in it, only the cold weight of last night's whisper. She turned her head to look at Ethan, who was still asleep beside her. His features were relaxed, his breathing steady. The man she had promised to love for a lifetime, the man who had held her hands just hours ago, vowing to cherish her. And yet, the name Serena hung between them like an invisible chasm, a ghost she hadn't known existed. Carefully, she slipped out of bed, letting the sheets pool behind her. She needed space, clarity, answers. In the bathroom, she turned on the faucet, splashing cold water onto her face. As she gripped the edge of the sink, her reflection stared back at her. Wide, uncertain eyes, lips pressed into a tight line. She had never been the jealous type, never the kind to overthink things. But this wasn't just a passing remark or an old story shared over dinner. This was her husband's subconscious, his deepest, most unguarded moment. Who was Serena? A childhood friend? A lost love? Someone he had let go of, but never truly forgot? The thoughts twisted inside her, an ache forming in her chest. She exhaled slowly, gripping the counter. This isn't the time to panic. She needed to talk to him. It was the only way to put her mind at ease. With that resolve, she walked back into the bedroom. Ethan had shifted onto his back, the morning light catching the sharp angles of his jaw. She hesitated, then reached out, lightly brushing his arm. Ethan? His eyes flickered open, adjusting to the brightness. A small, drowsy smile touched his lips. Morning, love. Her throat tightened. Love. She used to revel in the way he said it. But this morning, it felt different. She sat on the edge of the bed, folding her hands in her lap. Ethan, I need to ask you something. His smile faded slightly as he propped himself on his elbow. That sounds serious. She forced a small, almost nervous laugh. Maybe it is. His brows knitted together, concern creeping into his gaze. What is it? She hesitated, then spoke carefully, her voice steady but soft. Last night, you said a name in your sleep. A pause. A flicker of something unreadable in his expression. His body tensed just slightly, so small that if she weren't watching him so closely, she might have missed it. What name? His voice was casual, but there was something off about it. She swallowed. Serena. Silence. The kind that stretched too long, that weighed heavy with unsaid things. His lips parted, but no words came. Why does he look trapped? Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully measured. I don't know anyone by that name. Her stomach dropped. Are you sure? She pressed, studying his face. He nodded, sitting up fully now. Yeah. Maybe you misheard. A simple response. So logical, so reasonable. But the way his shoulders stiffened, the way he avoided her gaze for just a second too long, it wasn't right. He's lying. The realization stung, sharp and unexpected. She had always trusted Ethan. He was steady, dependable, the kind of man who didn't play mind games or hide things. So, why was he lying to her now? She searched his face, hoping for something, anything, that might make sense of this. But he was already shifting, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as if the conversation had never happened. Come on, he said, forcing a light tone. It's our first morning as husband and wife. Let's not start the day with weird dreams. He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, lingering for just a moment. She didn't move, didn't respond, because deep down, she knew it wasn't just a dream. And Serena wasn't just a name. She tried. She really did. She pushed the name to the back of her mind, let Ethan's warmth pull her into their honeymoon plans, let the laughter and champagne fill the cracks of unease. But at night, when everything was still, when her mind was left alone with its thoughts, Serena came back. She dreamed of her, or at least of the name. She saw glimpses, a girl standing in the rain, a pair of eyes filled with silent grief, a hand slipping away. The dreams were fragmented, incomplete. But each time she woke, she felt that same lingering sense of loss. She wasn't imagining it. Her mind was trying to tell her something. 2 weeks later, back home, she finally broke. Ethan had left for work early, kissing her goodbye like everything was normal. But she wasn't fooled anymore. She grabbed her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she typed. Serena. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe an old connection, maybe a name in some article, anything. But what she found made her breath hitch. A news article. 7 years ago. Local man risks life to save woman from a burning car. Serena Hayes, 23, was pulled from the wreckage by an unknown passerby before emergency responders arrived. The rescuer left before he could be identified, but witnesses recall a young man covered in blood, refusing treatment before disappearing into the night. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Serena Hayes. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Ethan saved her. And he never told her. But if he risked his life for this woman, why was he acting like she didn't exist? And why, after all these years, was she still haunting his dreams? Her hands trembled as she reread the article. Serena Hayes. The name that had been haunting her husband's dreams was now staring back at her from the glowing screen. The picture attached to the article showed a young woman, her face pale, her eyes distant, the kind of look people have after coming too close to death. A million thoughts flooded her mind. Ethan had saved this woman's life. He had been there, pulled her from the wreckage, bled for her. And yet, he acted like she didn't exist. A chill ran down her spine. She wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe it wasn't that significant to him. But no. People don't forget nearly dying for someone. And people definitely don't murmur someone's name in their sleep if they meant nothing. Her stomach twisted. She had two choices. 1. She could pretend she never found this. Bury it. Go on with their lives as if Serena was just a ghost from the past. 2. She could confront Ethan. Demand the truth. Her grip tightened on the phone. She needed answers. That night, she waited. Ethan came home late, shrugging off his coat, rolling his sleeves up like he always did. He kissed her temple as he passed, his touch warm, familiar, loving. But now, all she could think about was the woman in the article. Serena. She watched him as he moved around the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, completely unaware that his wife had spent the entire day unraveling his secret. The lie. The silence. It was all too much. She set her phone down on the counter with a deliberate thud. Ethan. He looked up, brows raising slightly. Yeah. She inhaled. Who is Serena Hayes? A beat. She saw it, the flicker in his expression, the momentary stiffening of his shoulders. But just as quickly, he masked it, placing his glass down. Why are you asking? Her heart pounded. Not even a who, just. Why are you asking? I found an article today. Her voice was steady, but she could feel the emotions coiling tight inside her. 7 years ago, you pulled her from a burning car. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I didn't, he stopped, shook his head. I wasn't expecting this. That makes 2 of us. A silence stretched between them, heavier than before. She crossed her arms. Why did you lie to me? I didn't lie, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. He hesitated. It wasn't important. Her chest ached. Not important, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You risked your life for her. You were covered in blood, Ethan. You disappeared before anyone could even thank you. And now, years later, she swallowed. You still dream about her. His jaw tightened. She saw it then. The war inside him. Just tell me the truth. Her voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. Please. Another silence. Then, finally he spoke. When I pulled her out, he said, voice low, she was barely conscious. She was bleeding, broken. She didn't even know my name. He exhaled sharply. But before she passed out, she looked at me, and she said. He stopped. looked away. What did she say? His throat bobbed. When he finally met her eyes again, his voice was hoarse. She said, "Please don't let me be alone." Her breath caught. Something inside her cracked, a tiny fracture she hadn't expected. She was afraid she was going to die, he continued, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, I promised her I wouldn't let her be alone. The words hung heavy between them. She gripped the counter behind her, trying to process everything. But you did leave. You disappeared. His lips pressed into a thin line. I had to. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Why? Another long pause. Then softly, almost too softly, he admitted, because if I had stayed, I wouldn't have been able to walk away. Her stomach dropped. What? She stared at him, the weight of his confession sinking in. Are you saying you? The words wouldn't come out. I don't know what I'm saying. His voice was rough, conflicted. I don't know what I felt back then. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something else. But I left before I could figure it out. Silence. Her fingers curled against the cold marble. Do you still love her? He flinched. Actually flinched. And in that moment, she felt something shatter inside her. Because if he didn't still love Serena, he would have answered without hesitation. But he hadn't. And that silence was the worst answer of all. For the first time since their wedding, she slept in a different room. She told herself she needed space, to think, to breathe. But the truth was, she couldn't bear to lay beside him, knowing that another woman's memory still lived in his heart. She should have been angry, furious. But instead, she just felt lost. What did this mean for them? Did she mean less to him than she thought? Or was this just an old wound, one that had never properly healed? And could she ever be enough to heal it? By morning, her decision was made. She needed to find Serena. She needed to know if she was fighting a ghost, or a love that had never truly died. The morning was eerily quiet. She sat at the edge of the bed in the guest room, staring at the soft golden light filtering through the curtains. Sleep had eluded her the entire night, her mind running in endless circles. Ethan had barely spoken since their conversation. When he woke up, he lingered by the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. But neither of them said anything. And now, as she sat alone, her decision weighed heavily in her chest. She needed to see Serena Hayes. Her hands trembled as she typed the name into the search bar again, skimming through articles and public records. Finally, she found something useful, a small medical clinic in a quiet part of the city. Serena was a doctor. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman Ethan had once risked his life to save was now saving lives herself. A deep breath steadied her nerves. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but she needed to hear it from Serena herself. Was Ethan just a fleeting memory in her life? Or had she been waiting for him all these years, just like he had unknowingly held on to her? The clinic was small but inviting, nestled between two larger buildings. A tiny bell chimed as she stepped inside, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. A receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," she said quickly. "But I was hoping to see Dr. Serena Hayes. Is she available?" The receptionist glanced at the schedule. "She's between patients right now. I can check if she's willing to see you." "Thank you." She sat down, gripping her purse tightly as she waited. The minutes felt endless. Then, finally, "Miss." She looked up. The woman standing before her was younger than she expected, early 30s at most. Serena had soft brown eyes and delicate features, but there was something almost fragile in the way she held herself, as if she had been carrying the weight of something unseen for too long. "Yes." Serena hesitated before gesturing toward a private consultation room. "You wanted to speak to me?" She stood, forcing a polite smile. "Yes." Once inside, the door closed softly behind them, enclosing them in a space that felt both too intimate and too suffocating. Serena motioned for her to sit, then perched on the chair across from her, studying her with quiet curiosity. "I don't believe we've met before." "We haven't," she swallowed. "But we have something in common." Serena's brows furrowed slightly. And that is? Her heart pounded.
Ethan.
Serena's expression froze. For a second, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she exhaled, leaning back slightly. I see. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You remember him, don't you? She pressed. 7 years ago. The car accident. The man who pulled you out. Serena's lips parted, but she didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was answer enough. She clenched her hands together. Do you still love him? Serena flinched, her eyes flickering with something. Pain? Regret? Then, she let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was tired.
Worn.
I never loved Ethan, Serena said softly. I didn't even know his name until recently. A sharp breath left her lungs. Serena looked down at her hands. I spent years wondering who he was. He saved my life, then vanished. I wanted to thank him, but no one knew where he went. She shook her head. But love?
No.
That wasn't what I felt for him. She hesitated, then lifted her gaze. But I think he loved me. The words hit harder than she expected. Serena continued, her voice tinged with sorrow. I don't think he even realized it himself. Sometimes, when someone saves you, they carry a part of you with them. Maybe I became more than just a person to him. Maybe I became a symbol of a moment he couldn't let go of. She swallowed, her throat painfully tight. But I don't love him, Serena repeated, firm this time. And if you're here because you're afraid of me, don't be. He's yours. Her chest ached. Was he? Serena watched her closely, then sighed. You're not really afraid of me, are you? She looked away. I don't know what I'm afraid of. Serena nodded slowly, as if she understood something even she couldn't put into words. Then, after a moment, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out something small. A keychain. She held it out. I kept this for years, Serena murmured. It was in my hand when he pulled me out. The last thing I remember before I blacked out. She hesitated before taking it. It was old, the silver worn down with time. A simple design. 2 interlocked rings, one slightly larger than the other. Do you know what this means? Serena asked. She shook her head. Serena smiled, but it was bittersweet. Neither do I. But maybe Ethan does. She held onto the keychain the entire ride home. Her mind felt like a battlefield. A war between love and doubt, between the past and the future. Ethan wasn't home when she arrived. For the first time in days, she was relieved. She needed time to think. She set the keychain on the kitchen counter, running her fingers over the faded silver. Maybe Serena was right. Maybe Ethan hadn't loved her, but the idea of her, the weight of a promise made in a moment of desperation. But even if that was true, where did that leave them? She didn't realize she was crying until a single tear hit the counter. Was she willing to keep fighting for a marriage built on shadows? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. She wasn't walking away without the truth. And when Ethan came home tonight, she was going to get it. Ethan returned home late that evening. She heard the front door open and close, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he entered. For a long moment, she remained seated at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the keychain Serena had given her. The air between them was thick with unsaid words. Ethan finally stepped into the kitchen, his expression guarded. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, but exhaustion clung to him in a way she hadn't seen before. You're still awake, he murmured. She didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she held up the keychain. Do you recognize this? Silence. Then, a sharp inhale. She looked up just in time to see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the way his body stiffened, how his jaw clenched. Yes, he admitted, his voice hoarse. Her heart pounded. It was in Serena's hand the night you saved her. He looked away, running a hand through his hair. So, you met her? Yes. More silence. She placed the keychain on the table between them. Tell me the truth, Ethan. What does this mean to you? What does she mean to you? He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples as if the weight of her question was physically painful. I don't know how to explain it. Try. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He hesitated for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, when I pulled her out of that wreck, he started, his voice low, I thought she was dead. Her breath hitched. Ethan's eyes darkened, as if the memory was playing out in front of him. She wasn't breathing.
Her pulse was weak.
I had to carry her in the rain, covered in her blood, thinking. He cut himself off, exhaling shakily. Thinking that I was too late. Her throat tightened. She survived, he continued. Barely. I never got to see her again after that.
But the moment stayed with me.
I dreamed of it for years. Not because I loved her, but because I failed her. She frowned. Failed her? You saved her life. He shook his head. Not completely. I found out later that her parents didn't make it. She lost everything that night. And he let out a bitter chuckle. I disappeared. I didn't even know her name. All I had was this keychain. A damn keychain I picked up from the wreckage and kept, like it meant something. She stared at him, her heart aching. So, when I murmured her name in my sleep, Ethan swallowed. It wasn't love. It was guilt. It was regret. It was a memory I couldn't let go of. Her chest felt tight. You never loved her? He met her gaze, raw and unguarded.
No.
I loved the idea of saving her, of making sure she was okay. But she was never the woman I loved. The room was so silent, she could hear her own heartbeat. Then who do you love? She whispered. Ethan took a step closer. Then another. His fingers brushed over hers on the table, hesitant, as if afraid she would pull away. You. His voice was hoarse, filled with something heavy, something real. It's always been you. Tears burned at the edges of her vision. But she wasn't ready to forgive him just yet. Because love wasn't just words. It was choices. And she needed to know if he would choose her over the past, over the weight of his own ghosts. I don't know if I believe you, she admitted. Ethan flinched slightly but nodded, accepting it. Then let me prove it to you. Her lips parted, but no words came. Because deep down she wanted to believe him. She just didn't know if her heart could afford to be broken again. The next few days were different. Ethan didn't push her for forgiveness. Instead, he showed her. He made time for her, listened more carefully, asked about her thoughts, her feelings. He took her on small dates, ones that felt intimate, late-night coffee runs, quiet strolls in the park, slow dances in their living room. He didn't say, I love you every day. But he proved it in the little things. She noticed the way he reached for her hand absent-mindedly, how his fingers traced comforting circles on her back when she was lost in thought. The way he memorized the smallest details, her favorite tea, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way she liked to be held when she felt sad. And slowly, her heart softened. One night, as they sat on the balcony together, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet. I don't deserve your forgiveness yet. She glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his eyes. But I'll spend the rest of my life earning it if you'll let me. Her breath hitched. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. A small, tentative smile. Then start now, she whispered. And when Ethan leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her lips, it felt like a promise. Not of perfection, but of healing. Months passed. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments where the past threatened to creep in. But they faced it together. Ethan started therapy, working through the guilt he had carried for years. She learned to trust him again, to let herself love without fear. And on the anniversary of their wedding, Ethan took her hand, leading her to the place where they had once said their vows. I want to marry you again, he said softly. Tears welled in her eyes. We're already married, Ethan. He smiled. Then let's do it right this time. And under the soft glow of fairy lights, with only the stars as their witnesses, she said yes. Not to forgetting the past, but to choosing their future. Ethan never dreamed of Serena again. Not because she wasn't important, but because he had finally let go. And in her place, every night when he closed his eyes, he dreamed of her. The woman he had fought for. The woman he had chosen. The woman he would spend the rest of his life proving his love too. And this time, he wouldn't let her go. Years later, on a quiet morning, she stood by the window, watching the sun rise. The sky was painted in soft hues of gold and pink, the world outside slowly waking. She felt Ethan's arms wrap around her waist from behind, his warmth familiar, his presence steady. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured against her shoulder. She smiled, leaning into him. "Just thinking." He hummed, pressing a gentle kiss to her hair. "Good thoughts." She turned in his arms, gazing up at him, the man who had once been haunted by a name, a past he couldn't let go of. Now, his eyes held nothing but love for her. "The best thoughts," she whispered. Ethan cupped her face, his thumb tracing over her cheek. "Tell me." She laced her fingers with his, pressing his palm to her heart. "That I'm glad I stayed. That I'm glad we stayed." A soft smile touched his lips. "No regrets?" he asked, though his tone was teasing. She shook her head, laughing softly. "None." Because love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about choosing each other, over and over again. And as Ethan kissed her, slow and deep, she knew. Their story had been filled with pain, with misunderstandings, with scars that took time to heal. But in the end, love had won. And it always would.